another week. This week we're going to be talking about the study of space through what is called proxemics. If you opened up the textbook and saw that title, you might not have thought it was that exciting. But this is actually one of my favorite chapters because this is covering content that we really don't think about as being nonverbal communication, as far as how we balance space and our different personal boundaries, and also how we define our environment. And these are things, again, that we haven't thought of before, or don't necessarily associate, if we have thought about them, associate them with any communicative meaning. And they do have meaning. So it's important to address these. The chapter starts off by talking about the influence and impact of culture. So they give you the German culture, that their issue, the way they deal with space is clearly defined by authority and boundaries, right? As in stay out of my space or no trespassing. Japanese culture is very limited in space due to the size of their country, right, and the size of their population, so they actually will miniaturize their environment. While the American culture, specifically in relation to the United States, we prioritize privacy, right? So we will do things in order to, keep people away from us, right, and manage our own control of our own environment. Now, there's a lot of differences across cultures, as just pointed out, but there's a lot of differences within cultures as well. So if you find that some of the findings don't relate to you specifically as a, United States citizen, it doesn't mean that they're not impactful within this environment. Most of the findings in this chapter are related to American culture. Okay, so, again, we do have discrepancy within that, so if it doesn't, meet your standards, obviously your different subculture reasons for that. They talk about this issue of privacy as really a balance between our affiliation needs and our privacy needs. So we want to be a part of a group. We want to be a part of a community. We want people to like us and get to know us, but we don't like people getting in our business. Right? We have many phrases for mind your own business, stay out of it, right? This is none of your business, keep out kind of mentality. And that deals more with our personal information, but it also deals with our environment. I have a home in Petoskey and I have a fence. I didn't actually put in the fence, but many of my neighbors when I moved in said, are you going to keep the fence? Or does that, I don't think your fence is in the right spot. What it communicates to them is that the people who lived here prior to me didn't want anything to do with them. Right? So it's a way of kind of saying this is my territory. You could do that for several reasons. I think the fence is pretty. It's white. It's low to the ground. So maybe I could use it for a pet. Maybe people use it to keep people off of their property. Or, if you have a dysfunctional neighbor, you want to say, okay, my yard is the clean, neat yard with the fence and yours, my neighbor's is not, right? So there are many reasons why we do it, but recognizing something as simple as a picket fence communicates something to people. Something I had never thought about prior to moving into a home with a fence. Another way, or a simpler way of thinking of our use of space is when you go to a movie theater, right? You go to sit in movie theater seats, they're close to one another, you're going to have strangers sitting next to you potentially, so you will immediately put your elbows onto, the armrests. Okay, to kind of indicate this is my space, don't put it on there. Now, if it's your friends, they might kind of nudge you and bump you off. If you're there with a significant other, you might be hanging all over the armrest just to get all snugly close to your significant other. You probably remember those middle school days. But the idea of kind of setting our boundaries and setting our space and saying, please don't come too close to me, is really an American thing, and there are going to be different cultures that are going to exemplify different status. When it comes down to the study of proxemics, what we're looking at is that structure or the microspace and how we're going to use that. So anything that is in our immediate environment, right, the possessions we have, the objects we're seeing around, right, the paint colors on the wall, all of these things are going to communicate something about us, and those are all considered our proximate environment. So when we look at the proximate environment, there's 5 different concepts that are going to compose this. The first one is space, then distance, territory, crowding, and then privacy. So the first one we're going to talk about is space. When we think of space, we think of personal space, okay? Personal space has more to do with the use of the body and with regard to distance. There are 3 types of actual space, and those are fixed feature, semi-fixed feature, and non-fixed feature. The fixed feature type of space deals with the fact that there are certain environments used for certain things, right? So we have certain rooms in our home, for example, right, where we will serve a formal dinner in a kitchen or in a dining room. We don't serve a formal dinner in a bathroom. We don't have a toilet in the kitchen, right? Things like that, where there are certain rooms that have certain functions. Do these change across time? Absolutely, right? The living room or family room, say circa 1960, might have been where people watched television. Now we have a television in the bedroom. We have a television in the kitchen. We have a television in the bathroom. There's televisions everywhere. So the function might shift across time, but more than likely we're not going to be having a formal dinner in our bathroom unless you have ever lived in a studio apartment where your entire living quarter are in one room. So again, always exceptions to the rule. Semi-fixed feature with regard to space are all of the things surrounding our environment, right? So it's the color of paint on the wall behind me. It's going to be the curtains that people hang up, the pictures that they display. All of these things communicate something about you. And we're going to get back to this when I actually address the paper topics. So bear with me on that one. The last type of space is this non-fixed feature portion. And that is really dealing with the body, right? This is your personal space boundaries. Now, we can create different types of involvement with regard to our personal spaces. So I'm sure you've walked into people's homes where you felt like, wow, it's so welcoming. It might be the smell, they're making coffee or cookies baking, or the colors are very soothing, the couch is comfortable, right? And you just feel at home or welcomed or cozy. Versus walking into a house very, Seinfeld-esque, and the couch has plastic on it, or the room is so fancy you feel like you can't, even sit down on the couch because you might put a crease in it. So environments, depending on how we structure our environment and what we put into it, can communicate this idea of involvement, or can also make us withdraw from a situation. If you don't, or have never really thought about this, think of your professor's office on campus, right? Do the offices communicate something about your professor? If it's a giant mess and there's papers everywhere, does that say something about who they are? Is it good? Is it bad? Does it feel inviting, welcoming, that you could go and ask them problems, or ask them for help with problems? What does that environment do? That is all really dealing with that semi-fixed feature. When it comes to that non-fixed feature, what it references is that personal space, and that ties into distance. Okay, we have 4 different types of distance. We have intimate, personal, social, and then public. When it comes to our intimate distance, the way I always think of this is, think of a hula hoop. If you were to put a hula hoop around you, okay, and place it against the small of your back and then stretch it out forward, right, that's about 18 inches will fit in that hula hoop. Okay, so who would you let inside of that hula hoop? Who are you going to let that close to you? First people we think of, romantic partners, right? Our significant other, we will let in. How else are we going to be smooching? Family and friends, we will let in. Of course, maybe to give a hug, and if they're, not like that crazy aunt or uncle that you have for the holiday that always wants to go in for the big hug or kiss. But we also, when it comes to strangers, will let in children, okay? Even if we do not particularly care for them, we will often let in the elderly because we sometimes think that they can't hear, and so that's why they're leaning close to us. We will also let in people if we're on public transportation. So if you've ever been on an airplane, that movie theater example, right? We will literally let somebody get close enough to touch us. Okay. Outside of that, the only other real group of people that we will let in without question are attractive people. Okay. So if I'm, attracted to this guy I find to be gorgeous, and he gets close to me, I will let him get within my intimate space, right? My actual hula hoop. Don't get all dirty birds on that, you crazies. But that idea of letting somebody in that close, okay? The next set of space is your personal space. When we talk about space, we say our personal space is our personal bubble. Our personal bubble is really our intimate space. When it comes to personal space, we're talking about a 1.5 feet out to 4 feet, about the stretch of your arm. Okay, if not a little bit longer. We will let a lot of people into that space. Our close friends, anytime you go out to dinner, they're probably within your personal space. The closer they get to that 1.5 feet away from you, that 18 inches, right, the more we might do the lean thing back, right? So if all of a sudden I start to lean in like this and I'm giving you the lecture in this fashion, how many of you physically just leaned away from me as my face got closer and closer to you, right? I'm not even in your space technically because I'm recording this at a different time than you're watching it. I'm not real, as in I'm not in the room with you. But the very idea that somebody is getting closer to you kind of makes us, as Americans, kind of pull back and pull away because they're getting closer to that intimate space. The third type of space is social space. That's 4 feet to 12 feet. It's kind of your classroom setting, right? When you're walking around in public, right? You're, potentially going downtown or going shopping. And then the last boundary is your public space. Public space is 12 feet out or more. Past 25 feet, we actually have a hard time hearing people. So there's a lot of avenues where people will be in your public space, and that doesn't seem to bother us, okay? So again, just a reminder off of the common knowledge, what we really call generally out in society our personal space is really our intimate space. It is the hula hoop. It is that personal bubble, okay? Our bubble is really determined by our comfort level, which is culturally driven and your family driven by social norms. It's important to acknowledge that they exist and not to violate people's personal bubbles. Now, when they talk about this in the textbook, they talk about expectancy violation theory, which is this idea that certain people can violate our space boundary expectations, and it can be a positive thing. Again, going back to that idea of attractive people, right? Women are more likely to be able to violate our personal space, whatever it may be, boundaries, and it not being such a violation compared to men. Young people versus old people, okay? Also, when it comes to the culture, they did a study where Mexican Americans stood a lot closer to one another and were more tolerant of that compared to Caucasian Americans compared to African Americans, where they need the most space. Also, space comes in with regard to your status difference, okay? So high status people will stand closer to one another. They'll have less distance. Where low status people kind of keep your distance, right? Keep it away from that. And maybe it's a sense of kind of creating a comfortable environment, comes with confidence that you feel like you can stand closer to one another. You almost have the right to. The people aren't going to kind of cringe or pull back, okay? Again, as soon as you see this in somebody, the lean back, that is clear nonverbal saying to you, you're too close. You're getting way too close to my bubble, and recognizing that different people have different standards of this. And we'll talk about that again when we talk about the issue of touch. But moving on now from space and distance, we're going to look at the issue of territory. Okay, so what comes up with territory is ultimately how you control your environment. And what control do you have over that? Whether it be a physical possession, right? And can you actually own it, right? Is it yours? The territory of your car or your bedroom is one thing. But what happens when you go into a classroom on the first day? You will have your seat. And if you say you got there 10 minutes early and you had to run to the restroom, you will put your coat on that seat, as in, this is my territory. This is where I am sitting, right? To kind of claim it. Then the next day, whether it be a week or 2 days later, you will come back, and if someone's in your seat, it's like, oh, wait a minute, that's my seat. That's where I came to sit, right? Do you own that chair? No, you've sat there, an hour and a half, 2 days prior to? And yet for some reason we feel like that is our territory, right? We're kind of pissing on our fire hydrant as a dog would do. There are 4 different types of territory. Okay, when it comes to big, broad territory, we have public territory, right? And there are certain people that control that. For the most part, in our culture and in this country, we're allowed to kind of go freely when we want to. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you can tour the White House or tour the Capitol. And yet there are certain rooms that you can go into, certain controls that people have over that. Okay. Same thing goes if you've ever traveled abroad and been to Vatican City, for an example, and actually gone to the Vatican. There's going to be the Swiss Guard that controls which rooms that you can get into. Okay. So that's a way of using the territory. In our everyday life, we have our home territory. And this can be very small things, right? When I was growing up, my dad had a favorite chair in the living room. And so, everyone knew not to sit in my dad's chair. And, of course, we were all girls and didn't want to anyway. But it was that idea of dad's recliner, right? And if dad was in the room, that was where he was going to sit. It was dad's chair. Your cat has a litter box, right? That is your cat's territory. Your kids, or maybe if if you don't have children, you have your own room. That is your territory. In fact, some people literally have, no boys allowed, or stay out, or Jenny's room, right? Keep out, don't touch my stuff kind of mentality. An interactional territory deals more with certain spaces that could be converted, right? The boundaries are mobile. Things like cafeterias or lobbies, right? That will, at a hotel or, in a conference area, that you can the boundaries will move, but there's certain territories that are established within it. This is where we eat. This is where we register for our hotel room or whatnot. The last part of territory is our body territory. And that comes again to this idea that I want to control who gets close to me, right? And how close you can get actually to me. So the first portion is what's called a stall space. And that is that idea of the phone booth around you, right? It's where, if you've ever been to any place that has a public bathroom that has more than one bathroom, there are stalls. And that idea that we want our separation, we want our privacy, we don't want to be going to a bathroom in like a communal Roman bath type of style. The next part of our body territory deals with use space. So if you're trying to do something, for example, lighting a cigarette, they talk about, your bowling swing, swinging a golf club, we need a certain amount of space around us to be able to actually do that. We can't have people, that close to us. Turn space deals with something as simple as waiting in line in a grocery store. I lived in Kentucky for 4 years while I was getting my PhD, and it was unbelievable to me how close people got to you in a grocery line. As in, people's carts would be pressed up against my back, like hitting me in the butt, and people would put their groceries on the conveyor belt with my groceries. So I wouldn't have even unloaded the cart, and they're already putting their stuff on. And I thought, here it's a public space, but we can't even separate our groceries, right? Because in Northern culture, we don't get that close to one another. You kind of respect. We even have those, things that you put on the conveyor belt indicating your stuff should go behind there. Another portion of the body territory that we'll deal with is this sheath space. And that really comes down to the skin or the clothes we wear. And that's our territory. This ties in with our possession type of space in that it looks at the objects that we have, right? So we don't like people touching our stuff. We don't like when people will come up and, if you've ever had anybody, I have people like straighten my scarf, or they'll straighten my hair, or my earring will be crooked, right? Or a necklace. If you've ever had somebody turn your necklace on you and you're like, oh, I have quite a small hula hoop, let's put it that way, that I don't like people that close to me. When people are getting to the point where they're actually physically touching me, right, to kind of move something, it feels uncomfortable. Even the objects that you have, right? Women, for the women that are listening to this, you might not like people going through your purses. Gentlemen, you might not like people in your wallet, right? It's just, this is your territory. This is your stuff. These are your things. And the idea of somebody touching it in our culture feels like a violation, and a negative violation. Now, the fourth type of proxemics deals with this issue of crowding. Again, going back to how big that hula hoop is, how close we're going to allow people to get to us, and then when they get close to us, how does it make us feel? This is different than sheer density. We can be crowded when there's one person in the room with us or one person next to us. It's a psychological state, okay? Versus density, which we'll talk about, is this idea of how many people are in a room, right? How many people are in a certain amount of space. Crowding, of course, is going to be impacted by density. If you are in a small room and you've got 10 people in there, you're going to probably feel crowded, but you could be in a large room with one person and still feel crowded, depending on how close that person is to you or how comfortable you feel with that person. It's important to recognize that. In our culture, that was an interesting finding that they talk about this idea of that if in your home there are 4 or more people in a room, okay, and not just a bedroom. So 4 people sharing a bedroom, say if you had 3 siblings, right? Or if all of the people in the household shared a room, that seems logical, that could feel a little bit crowded to me. But the idea that 4 of you can be in a living room or 4 of you can be in a kitchen, and that is kind of our standard for where the crowding feeling type comes from. Again, this is going to depend on the family that you grew up in, right? Did you come from a family that has 10 children, right? Or your grandparents lived with you. So you grew up, say, with 14 people in your home all the time, Okay, your tolerance for crowding is probably going to be a lot higher than somebody who grew up as an only child or maybe with a ton of people in their home, but in a very large home. So it's going to be dependent. They talk about this issue of jails, and I think this is important to acknowledge because what comes down to crowding is how much we can actually control our environment and control who's in it. And that's why we feel that way. It's why I say when you can be crowded with one person in a room, it's, can I control getting that person out of the room? Are they just too close to me? Are they leaning over my shoulder? That's why I'm feeling crowded? And normally it's some type of dislike for that person or the idea that I can't get away from them, even if I don't like them. I'm kind of trapped, which is why, this issue of jails is important. First, because jails are often overcrowded, but because the inmates don't have control over their environment, right? You don't get to pick. I've never been to jail, but from what I can tell, you don't get to pick who your cellmate is, right? Or how many cellmates you may have in any given situation. So that's an interesting avenue to kind of look at as far as why crowding is so impactful. And again, it's coming down to this idea of, can you control your environment? The last part of the chapter really deals with the last issue of privacy, which is really important in our culture. This is what we value as Americans, right? So how do we balance this idea of being a part of our group, controlling our environment, keeping information about ourselves private, right? And at the same time, being a part of a community or a group or a family. We have the bathroom is one of my favorite rooms because the bathroom is very stereotypically a private thing, right? When if you're going to go to the bathroom, you go into the bathroom and you normally do that by yourself. And you like to do it by yourself. And some people use it as their escape. But culturally, if you look at design, we now have these mega bathrooms, right? So you'll have a huge, clawfoot tub and a shower and 2 sinks and, probably still just one toilet. But the idea of even 2 sinks would indicate there would be 2 people in that bathroom at any given time. So this is where the American culture, again, kind of does this wishy-washy. A bathroom is where you go to do something private, yet we're now making them bigger and multifunctional, as in having two sinks, the idea that you'd have 2 people in there. And so how do we balance that, right? Can we ever get away from other people? There are 4 main types of privacy that the textbook talks about. They talk about physical privacy, literally where you're physically isolated, right, from other people. Social privacy, where you're going to withdraw from the social interaction, maybe because you're feeling uncomfortable or it's becoming overwhelming. Psychological privacy, where you don't say something, right, or you stop other people from saying it because you don't want to know that information. Maybe it's kind of that gossipy sense, right, where you're like, I don't want to hear this. And you're able to kind of control that. And then information privacy, and what you do with that is control the information out there about you. Okay. For example, I don't have social media. I don't have Facebook. I study it. That's what I have a PhD in, but I don't have any of those forms. So you could Google me and find some crazy quote I made in grad school. Otherwise, you're not going to find out a lot about information about me. I consider myself to be a very private person. Okay. A lot of people say that, and yet they turn around and they just throw everything else about themselves out there, right? All the information is there for everyone to see, especially on the internet. So there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. But to claim that you're a private person and yet, you're tweeting all day long, does that really match up? Is that contradictory? And how private are you? Is being a private person a good thing? Not necessarily, right? Maybe your life is an open book and you want everyone to view it. Perfectly fine. It's just that balance of what fits. It's not right or wrong. So overall, what they talk about is this, in this entire chapter, is that they have these overall general findings that I really want you to think about as far as whether you see them to be true or not. So they talk about this issue of the closer you move to someone, the more people are going to like you. Yet they also turn around and say that if you're unattractive, people don't want you in their space. So to me, if you were an unattractive person, you'd go, wait a minute, do I move closer to somebody because the research shows if you move closer, they'll like you more? Or do I stay away because research also shows that, people don't like unattractive people in their personal boundary or space? So there's a finding that it's a little bit contradictory, right? So what works, again, is adhering to social norms, kind of picking up on what other people are doing and balancing that. People are clear. right? The lean forward because you're not close enough to them for them to actually hear you, or they feel like you need to get closer, and the lean back are two very, very easy indicators of how well you are managing other people's personal boundaries and their space. They talk about how dominant people engage in closer interactions, right? So they'll get closer to one another, that idea of high status. Again, we welcome women into our close space more than we do men. There may be many reasons for this. One, women tend to be less threatening than men, just in the very physical sense. We also stereotypically think of women as more nurturing and warm, and they're the huggers, and they're the ones who share their emotions, so it makes sense that they would be closer to us. We welcome attractive people into our personal space, okay? And we are more comfortable with anyone who is a high status or has something to offer us, right, as a positive violation into our space. So if all of a sudden a little kid runs up to you and hugs you, you're not going to be like, psh, get away from me. Even if you don't like children, right? Because that idea that it's a warmth, it's a positive gesture coming your way. It's something that is seen as positive. So, with regard to this chapter, we hopefully talked about a lot of the things that maybe you stereotypically, again, have not thought of as nonverbal communication. The one that I'm going to have you focus on for the paper is going to be on the semi-fixed feature of space, okay? So this is the role of the environment. The reason I'm having you focus in on this is because of the research that's been done to show that your environment is more telling of your true character than anything that you're ever going to, write down or say about yourself. So, and they did this as job interviews, actually. Instead of calling people into job interview, they actually showed up at people's homes and they analyzed their environments. And some of you are going, what? That sounds a little bit scary. But a messy environment or dust everywhere does not necessarily communicate something negative, right? It may be something that you're a creative person or you're clearly very active and busy and don't have time to dust or pick up things. So we have certain associations with certain things, such as dust everywhere would mean that you are lazy or uncleanly, but that isn't always necessarily the case. So what I'm going to have you do for your paper is analyze your environment. Some of you are homeowners. You can take your entire home. If you just are still living at home with your parents, maybe you have a bedroom, or even if you just share a bedroom, or you could even potentially do the inside of your car, as in you probably control that unless you share a vehicle, okay? And what I want you to do is describe that to me. So what does your room look like, or what does your home look like? And then I want you to strategize, really, because you might not know what you think that says about you, right? So what does the clean house or the paint color or the pictures that you display communicate about you? You can also ask other people, or maybe you've already been told, what other people say. So my house, I have a white theme where a majority of, the couch is white, the bedding is white, most of the curtains are white, or blue and white, or black and white. And a lot of people will say that just is so typical of my order and cleanliness. And that's what it, communicates to them. And I think, oh, wait a minute, that's not what my goal was, right? My goal was just to have a neutral palette where everything could be interchanged. I could just, show off my accessories or change those when I wanted to. So here's an example of what my environment communicates to people when they walk in, is that of order and cleanliness. And what I was hoping to do by painting it certain colors and, and buying the furniture I bought was communicate something different. So sometimes they're contradictory. So if you have the opportunity to ask what other people think, that's going to be important, again, because until people let us know what we're communicating, we often don't know it, or we have a certain impression that other people do not have. So good luck with that task this week, and I look forward to reading your papers. This is going to be a more informal paper, right, as far as you're not going to have a lot of definitions. This is more about you, so feel free to write with I, right, your room, my room. That's perfectly fine. I will see you next week for Chapter 6.